Europeans had, our families had, very difficult night. One of the biggest attacks from the very beginning of this war.
Canada has committed billions to help Ukraine's military in its fight against Russia. This after getting praise for a pledge to arm its own military.
The fact that you decided to bring Canada to the 2% spending when it comes to NATO this year is really fantastic.
And look forward to defining those new responsibilities and capabilities.
But any hopes for more FaceTime with the U.S. president are dashed as Donald Trump leaves the summit for the Situation Room.
Remember, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. It's very simple. Look at it better than a ceasefire. We're not looking for a ceasefire.
We have a lot on the go today. Just ahead, an exclusive interview with the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte. And next hour, we'll bring you live to the G7 Summit closing press conference with Prime Minister Mark Carney. So let's get to it, as Power and Politics starts right now. As tensions escalate in Iran, Israel, and Ukraine put an increased focus on defense at this G7 summit, Prime Minister Mark Carney had a one-on-one meeting with NATO's Secretary General this morning. It's been only 1 week since Carney announced plans to meet NATO's 2% of GDP defense spending target by March. And today, Carney's office said he told Mark Rutte about his plan for accelerating those investments in the years to come. Mark Rutte is the Secretary General of NATO, and he joins me now. Secretary General, it's good to see you. Thank you, sir.
Pleasure to be on the program.
I saw in your conversation with Prime Minister Mark Carney today, you praised Canada for finally developing a plan to get to the 2%. Some of that including capacity for things like the Coast Guard. So I'm wondering what new support that truly brings to the alliance with this target finally being met.
Well, this is really a big announcement. Let's not underestimate it. It means that Canada will reach the 2% this year, which is great news because it was originally foreseen after 2030. Last week, Portugal also announced it will reach 2% this year. And by Portugal also making that announcement, we now have the whole of the alliance, all 32 countries, the whole of the alliance at 2% before the summit in The Hague next week. Whilst at the beginning of the year, we had still 8 countries not making the 2%. So this is really great news.
Well, Canada is getting there 11 years after making the commitment and just before it's going to rise. 3.5% of GDP on direct spending and maybe another 1.5% on other spending, a total of 5% of GDP. How confident are you Canada can hit that likely new target, and what assurance did you get from the Prime Minister on that?
Yes, well, I'm fairly confident that Canada and the whole of the alliance can do this. It is important because we have to protect ourselves against our adversaries, so like Russia, but also China, which is increasingly building up its armed forces. So we have to make sure we have what we need to defend ourselves. And with the 2%, we simply cannot going forward defend ourselves. Yes, today, but not in 3 to 5 years. So therefore, we have to ramp up the defense spending. And we will come to a decision next week in The Hague. I'm fairly confident we will get there.
You said recently, Secretary General, that you thought that within 5 years, Russia would be able to launch an attack against NATO countries, either in Eastern Europe or elsewhere. Do you think that is their intention to do that within 5 years, or they just might have the capacity to do that within 5 years?
It's very difficult to exactly get into the head of Vladimir Putin. I stopped a long time ago to do that. But clearly we have to be ready for every eventuality. We know that China is building up its armed forces. They're not doing that only for the parades in Beijing. They want to do something with all those ships and fighter jets, etc. We know the direct threat, of course, there is China towards Taiwan. And the wider Indo-Pacific. And we know, of course, what Putin, as we speak, is doing in Ukraine last night. Again, targeting innocent civilians in Kiev. Many people dying, many more people seriously wounded. So this is continuing. So we have to stand prepared to make sure that our deterrence is such that he will never, ever try to attack us.
So on the Ukraine-Russia conflict, just for a second there, Secretary General, the drone strike, the drone attack that Ukraine launched against the strategic bomber fleet of Russia took out about 40% of its capacity, I believe. Obviously good news in this conflict, good news for NATO, but how quickly do you think Russia can replenish that and rebuild?
Well, of course, this was a very important development 2 weeks ago, and we all applaud what Ukraine did on that Sunday, which was well prepared, in total secrecy for many months. So this was a big operation hitting at Russia's capability to again target innocent civilians in cities and communities inside Ukraine. So they are absolutely these are absolutely justifiable targets. It is difficult to exactly assess how long it will take for the Russians to reconstitute that particular base of capabilities. But no doubt they will try to do that. But this is a significant hit at Russia's capabilities to target innocent civilians in Ukraine.
You mentioned the attacks on Kyiv directly. Russia always seems to do this, whether it's a G7 summit or a NATO summit. They accelerate actions and targeting often of civilian infrastructure. We saw Canada announce today an extra $2 billion in military support for Ukraine, a $2.3 billion loan for broader governmental support. I just wonder what your thoughts are, sir, on the overall level of support Ukraine has at this point in the conflict, especially with the changing nature of things in the United States.
Well, clearly the allies are committed to continue supplying Ukraine with what they need. So over the first 3 months of this year, it was about 20 billion euros, so about 24 billion US dollars being pledged for Ukraine. And that is a bigger amount than last year over the same 3 months. So we are really maintaining that level of support. And Canada, indeed, is absolutely stepping up here and doing a lot to support Ukraine. And you're also leading the Forward Land Force in Latvia. So Canada is providing a lot of support to NATO generally, but also particularly when it comes to keeping Ukraine in the fight.
What's your sense of where things stand with the United States right now, Secretary General? Donald Trump left the summit without meeting with you, without meeting with President Zelensky. Did the U.S. officials give you any reassurance on their commitment to NATO and their commitment to Ukraine at the summit?
Absolutely. I've spoken so many times now with President Trump, and of course he will be at the NATO summit next week. We will have ample time to sit down. There was no meeting foreseen at this meeting between me and President Trump because we will meet each other extensively next week. President Trump in the US is completely committed to NATO, completely committed to Article 5. The attack on one is an attack on all clause in the NATO articles of Washington Treaty. So there is no doubt. But what they do expect, of course, is for the allies outside the US to step up in terms of defense spending, to equalize with what the US is spending. And we have to do that because to reach these targets, our capability targets, we have to bring it up to about 3.5%, which at the same time will equalize the spending in Canada and in Europe with the United States. So that creates a stronger, a more equal, a more strongly based alliance going forward.
But the defense of Ukraine itself, sir, what are your thoughts on where the United States is on this? Because there is another conflict that they may become embroiled in, or that's brewing today between Israel and Iran. What's your sense of just how committed the Trump administration is right now to President Zelensky and his people's cause?
I believe they are. We have seen President Trump breaking the deadlock with President Putin by starting these direct talks. I think that was particularly important because it has to be the United States, being such a powerful ally, to have those direct talks with the Russian president. So I applaud that. I commend him for this. And obviously we all want this to go faster, but this always takes time. It is a step-by-step approach. But I really sense in my conversation with President Trump that he is totally committed to bring the fight in Ukraine, this unprovoked war of aggression by the Russians against Ukraine, to a durable, towards a lasting peace, by which the Russians will never try to attack Ukraine again in the future.
So, Secretary General, I know you have to go, but if I can indulge you for just one more question. President Trump left this summit. He's in the Situation Room in Washington, monitoring what's happening between Israel and Iran. There is reporting suggesting America might be prepared to join the war or play a direct role in this conflict. What are your thoughts on the possibility of a core key NATO member potentially getting involved in the war between Israel and Iran directly?
Well, as you know, NATO concentrates on the Euro-Atlantic. The current situation between Israel and Iran is not part of what NATO is working on, but individual allies are navigating this crisis, including the United States. This is a rapidly developing situation, so I'm a bit hesitant to comment on that, and let's await the situation over the next 24 and 48 hours.
Okay. And Secretary General, Canada is getting ready, it looks like, to join the Rearm Europe initiative. What are your thoughts on what that would mean for the NATO alliance?
Well, I think everything which helps for Canada, the Europeans and the US to, one, make sure that we spend on the right stuff. Secondly, to really develop the defense industrial base in the US, in Canada, in Europe. I applaud that. So every initiative leading towards that direction has my full support.
Okay. Secretary General Mark Rutte, we appreciate your time on a very busy day at a very
Thank you
busy
so
summit.
much.
Thank you, sir.
And hope to see you next week. Bye-bye. Take care.
Okay, since we did that interview with the Secretary General, we have learned that the G7 will not be issuing a unanimous statement on the war between Russia and Ukraine. The reason for that is that the Americans objected to the stronger language that the other countries wanted to put in that communique, because the U.S., of course, is in the middle of a peace process, was trying to broker a peace between Russia and Ukraine, and it wanted to water down some of the language that the other G7 nations wanted in it. Prime Minister Mark Carney, as the chair of the G7, is exercising his discretion to use the tougher language in a separate statement from the chair that will come out later today. And of course, we'll hear from the Prime Minister directly next hour. Prime Minister Mark Carney, though, also announced new supports for Ukraine today, hours after Russia launched its deadliest assault on Kyiv in almost a year. And that's where we're going to start with our panel. That's coming up next. Canada announced $4.3 billion in new support for Ukraine this morning. Prime Minister Mark Carney made the announcement at the G7, standing next to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The pledge of support comes just after Russia's deadliest attack on Ukraine this year.
We need support from our allies, and I'm here, and thank you for the military package. It's important for our soldiers to be strong at the battlefield, to stay strong out until Russia will be ready for the peace negotiations.
Canada's support package includes $2 billion in new military aid with funding for drones, ammunition, and armored vehicles. The disbursement of a $2.3 billion loan to help rebuild infrastructure and public systems, plus a new sanctions package. Zelensky is one of the many world leaders gathered in the Rockies. They are meeting as the world faces escalating conflicts on multiple fronts. And to help make sense of it all, three experts in politics and geopolitics are joining me this hour. Veena Najibullah is Vice President Research and Strategy at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Arif Lalani is a former Canadian ambassador to Jordan, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the United Arab Emirates. And Brian Clow is a former Deputy Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who worked a lot on the Canada-US file in particular. It's good to see you all. Brian, I want to start with you if I can. I mean, the military aid and the financial support for Ukraine, not a big surprise to see that come from Prime Minister Mark Carney, but the news we have late today is no joint statement on Ukraine because the U.S. wanted to hold back the language. So there is no communique on that, and Mark Carney is going to use stronger language in his chair statement when he speaks. What do you make of the inability to get consensus on this conflict here?
Well, to a large extent, it's not a surprise because Donald Trump has been clear that he is not aligned with the rest of the G7 when it comes to Ukraine. And he made that clear again yesterday when he chose to, alongside Mark Carney, not agreeing with Mark Carney, but standing next to Mark Carney. He went on and on about why he thought Putin should be at the G7, which I think is a bit absurd. Donald Trump made it clear that he wanted this war to end on day one. He actually told Justin Trudeau that before he took office, that he expected this war to be done on day one. Good if the war can end, but not if it means Ukraine surrenders to Putin's demands.
Yeah, Veena, it's perhaps not a surprise that there's no unanimity when sort of the opening remarks from the president was lamenting the absence of Vladimir Putin, right? I mean, what do you make of this and what it may mean?
I think absolutely it's not a surprise. And it's good that Prime Minister Carney is moving ahead with a stronger chair statement. I think it was also important for President Zelensky to be present at the G7 and to meet with other leaders, including the outreach partners that were invited. I noted that he had discussions also with the Indian Prime Minister. He also had strong discussions with the Japan Prime Minister, who he normally doesn't see because obviously President Zelensky interacts quite a bit with NATO leaders. So I think it was important to have democratic solidarity from Japan and others, and for him to be able to make the case to India in particular, who will be meeting with President Putin. Prime Minister Modi will be meeting with Putin in short order.
Arif, what's your sense on this one?
Well, look, I think they did the best they could. Everybody knew that there wouldn't be unanimity, but I think the challenge is coming in a couple of weeks. It's okay for the G7 to do this, but when you go to the NATO alliance meeting, the alliance has to show that it is actually united, and that has to include the United States. So I think they've kind of punted this forward, but there's going to have to be a lot of discussion in the coming weeks to see how it lines up at NATO.
So Arif, like, what kind of work do you need to do between now and when they gather in The Hague for that NATO summit? Because there's a series of international summits coming up over the next couple of weeks in Europe. The NATO is summit's going to be ostensibly about getting a new spending target of 3.5% plus on top of that. I mean, how do you take steps between now and then to try to get the U.S. into in line with everybody else?
Well, I think there's a couple of ways you can do this. I mean, one is kind of the way Prime Minister Carney did it bilaterally on India, which is to take care of a number of issues on their own ahead of the summit. So everybody knows the positions, do what you can separately, and then at the summit, there's I think less to deal with. Or the other way is to have some kind of a much more watered down statement, or you have to have officials working to come to some agreement on what language can be interpreted. Often when we negotiate these things, will walk away saying, well, country X is going to interpret this word in one way and it's okay for us, and country X is going to interpret the same word in a different way. So I think there's some work officials can do to come out with some kind of a unified statement. But as always with, I think, the Trump administration, it's going to be unpredictable even during the meeting.
Well, Brian, you've had experience with Trump 1 and Trump 2 in your various roles in government. I mean, what's your thoughts on that, whether it is even likely that you can get Donald Trump to move into an area where he's in line with the G7 partners and the rest of NATO? Because they are kind of going their own way on this. They have gotten NATO to at least get to the 2% target, but on the actual use of the alliance and the purpose of the alliance, there's still these disagreements.
Yeah, as with many things with Donald Trump, it is a real challenge with the NATO summit coming up. And I think the goal there is the same as the goal at this G7 summit. It is survival, minimize the amount of disagreement, but fully recognizing the prospect of full unity on every issue, particularly Ukraine, Russia, is going to be very difficult with Donald Trump in the room.
Okay, on the 2%, though, we heard from Mark Rutte earlier, and Brian, start with you on this. It was a week or so ago that the Prime Minister, announced the plan to accelerate things getting to 2%. And now the Secretary General says he's pleased with that because for the first time ever, all the members of the alliance at least have a plan to get to that spending floor. But now they want it to go to 3.5. Do you see a path where that's an easy thing for Canada to do?
Well, first off, it was a very big step for Prime Minister Carney to make the announcement he did. I think it's a good thing. And part of the reason he was able to do it is things changed in this country after the president's re-election and the threats against our sovereignty. And a lot more Canadians became supportive of such a big move, such a big expenditure. So getting to 2%, a big deal. Executing on that, it's going to be a challenge in the short term. Beyond that, the Canadians will have to examine any new target that's agreed to. But in the short term, Prime Minister Carney needs to try to get recognition from NATO allies for the big step that he just took.
Vina, what are your thoughts there? I mean, getting it to 2% is $60 billion a year. Getting it to 3.5, you're at $100 billion, plus getting it to 5%, which with the extra things that they wanted to add on, you're talking a whole lot more, right? It's a difficult thing to do, but maybe a necessary thing to do. What are your thoughts on where this may go on the defense spending side?
I think it was absolutely critical for Prime Minister Carney to make the announcement, both in the lead up to this G7 meeting, to be in the room with President Trump and others, and also in the lead up to the NATO summit. So we've made the announcement. There is some creative accounting, moving things around, Coast Guard and such. I think the critical issue is going to be, can we spend on procurement in particular? It's one thing to be able to raise salaries and the things that we can do, but there are a number of issues around the defense industrial base that would need to be addressed for us to be able to sustainably spend 2% and get up to 3.5% over time. And I think it'll be critical not only to do stuff with Europe. I think we said we'll rearm Europe, which is great, but we need to deepen partnerships with Korea and Japan and Australia in particular. And I think that's why it was important to have Prime Minister Albanese and President Lee at this G7 to begin those security and defense conversations with others, because we'll have to partner with them to be able to build the platforms we need, to buy the things that we need, and to spend the money, even if we find ways to sacrifice and allocate up to 3.5% in some future time.
So, Arif, I just wanted to close the loop on this and bring it back to Ukraine. I mean, where do you think President Zelensky is as he gets ready to leave this summit? He came here. He never got a meeting with President Trump because, he left to go back to Washington to deal with what's happening between Israel and Iran. And you have this mixed language coming out with a different view on things. I mean, how secure do you think Ukraine should feel at this point based on how things evolved here in Kananaskis?
I think he probably came away with the best that he could. I think President Zelensky really needs to count on the Europeans to do the heavy lifting for him with the Americans. And so I think the Europeans really need to lead the way and bring the Americans along. So I think that's a really important point. And I agree also with Vina that I think it's really important for President Zelensky to have met some of the other leaders outside of the G7 and outside of NATO to get that support. But like many other countries, you're really kind of seeing a world where the superpower is almost kind of what I call a shrugging superpower. It's kind of observing, it's taking opportunity where it can, but strategy and execution it seems to be very, very unpredictable for everybody.
Okay, while we're speaking, Vina, I'd like to start with you on this. Prime Minister Mark Carney is having his one-on-one with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Our expectation had been just before showtime that this meeting was going to happen later, after the Prime Minister had his press conference. Things are fluid at these summits. It got moved up, it accelerated. They've had their meeting. We're going to get the tape of their initial exchange in just a second. But Vina, what's your sense of what Mark Carney needs from this? We talked in the past on this show about the controversy surrounding inviting the Prime Minister of India, given the transnational repression ongoing in this country. What needs to come out of this for Mark Carney to be able to look at the people he's upset with this and say it was worth it?
I think it's going to be a critical meeting. Obviously, the handshake that happened earlier today will be important in setting the tone for the meeting that's taking place now. Prime Minister Carney would need some kind of a signal that India is willing to cooperate on law enforcement issues. He said that after the phone call that he had with Prime Minister Modi. Now it'll be interesting to see what that cooperation looks like. Is there going to be some kind of an expanded mechanism to deal with this issue? Is there going to be language coming out of the statement, particularly from Prime Minister Modi? Because I think we know for sure that Prime Minister Carney is going to say that these issues of transnational repression and law enforcement in the case of Niger were raised, but what comes out from Prime Minister Modi is going to be critical. But then more broadly, this is just the first step in rebuilding the relationship. You can't remove all grievances with one handshake or one meeting. There's going to be a long road ahead in the lead up to the G20. So these two leaders will have another chance to meet in September at the G20, and I'll be watching to see what happens between now and then at the level of exchange of high commissioners or restarting of trade negotiations to justify the meeting that just took place.
Okay, we'll dive more into that in just a sec, but first I want to show you the clip because Prime Minister Mark Carney, this is him greeting Prime Minister of India Narendra Modi as they met in Kananaskis just a few minutes ago. Let's take a look at that.
Good. May I say, Excellency Prime Minister, it's a great honor to host you at the G7. India has been coming to the G7, I believe, since 2018 in Biarritz. With our French partners, and it's a testament to the importance of your country, to your leadership, and to the importance of the issues that we look to tackle together, from energy security, from the energy transition that you're helping to lead, to the future of artificial intelligence, to the fight that we have against transnational repression, against terrorism, against other factors, and the work that we can do together. And it is my great honor to have you here. I enjoyed your intervention just now, and we look forward to our discussion.
Excellency, thank you for inviting me to attend the G7 summit. And I'm very happy to get this opportunity to come and visit the soil of Canada after 2015 and to be in touch with the people of Canada. India is the largest democracy in the world. During our chair of the G20 summit, we took many initiatives for the welfare of the world. And today, we are extending that resolve through the G7 summit and going to execute it through the help of this platform as well. So I think that this is a great opportunity for us to serve public good, the global goods. It has always been India's intention to promote global goods, and today through G7 we have that same opportunity. I believe that India-Canada relations are extremely important, and India and Canada should work together and achieve win-win cooperation in several areas. Canadian companies have invested in India in a big way. Indian people have also invested in Canada in a big way. We both stand for democratic values. Together, we can strengthen democratic values. We can strengthen humanity. If we work together, optimally utilize all our resources, we can work for the welfare of the entire humanity. And I'm extremely confident that we'll be able to do this task. Excellency, congratulations on a grand victory on this election. And I'm sure under your leadership, we will be able to work together in a positive way and take India-Canada relationship forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, that's the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, and Prime Minister Mark Carney. That was not an amazing feat of ventriloquism by the Prime Minister of India. That was his interpreter speaking just off screen, translating Narendra Modi's remarks into English. Brian, I'm just wondering, look, these things are always filled with praise and platitudes, but this relationship is not one that is filled with praise and platitudes. I just wonder what you make of what we saw there and what we heard there.
Two thoughts. One, there is rightly a fair amount of concern from some Canadians about this invitation, given what the Indian government is alleged to have been a part of and perhaps even supportive of. But, and you're going to see a pattern in many of my comments, Donald Trump changed everything with his threats against our sovereignty. And clearly, Mark Carney has assessed that it is a priority to rebuild links with key countries around the world where the relationship was strained. But secondly, I would say if Mark Carney can extract a commitment from the Indian government to cooperate with the investigations, that would be a major development. And I'd say if that happens, it would make the invitation worth it.
Well, Brian, you were working in Prime Minister Trudeau's office when that remarkable moment in the House of Commons happened, when Justin Trudeau revealed what they were aware of. And again, Thanksgiving Monday last year when the RCMP revealed certain things. I know there are limits to what you can say, but this notion of getting cooperation, I mean, in your experience, what is your sense of how willing and likely it is to see India move in a meaningful way on that?
It's going to be a challenge, and the evidence of that is the fact that we did not experience the cooperation that was wanted since those terrible events in 2023. But with a new Prime Minister, with this invitation here, I think there is an opportunity for a fresh start, and I'm hopeful that the Prime Minister Carney can extract certain commitments.
Arif, what are your thoughts on that? Obviously, they're going to be very friendly publicly. We won't know at all or for some time on how it went specifically behind closed doors, but what do you make of what we saw there?
Well, I think what you're seeing, though, is a very different tone and a very different approach, right? It's a very mature adult exchange. And I've been in the room when, amongst leaders, you can have a very candid exchange. And I think that there is a candid exchange that can be had to address each country's concerns. We clearly have a concern that's around law and enforcement and cooperation with our investigation. They have, for decades, clearly had a concern about intelligence and counterterrorism and us taking that seriously. And then third, I think there's an element of how you address each other publicly. So certainly the first part is being tackled. I think the law enforcement and intelligence part was also tackled before with some announcement that India and Canada were going to cooperate. So I think they're on the right track. And it seems to me, watching the two leaders, it's a very different exchange. And I think it's an exchange which can be quite candid in private.
Veena, your thoughts on that, and then we're going to take a quick break.
I think this meeting is building on a successful phone call. It's building on what we're hearing from the RCMP here, that India is beginning to cooperate. So both leaders framed the meeting in terms of multilateral significance of each other, so both of G7, but also of India as a rising power. I think the discussions probably will be frank on issues of transnational repression and terrorism. I noted that Prime Minister Carney added that because that has been India's concern. So as long as this can be approached from a perspective of both countries have serious concerns, but both countries also have interest in cooperating. We need each other to be able to reduce over-reliance on the US, both for India and for Canada. That's a priority. We need each other to make our Indo-Pacific strategies a success and deal with challenges emanating from China. And ultimately, even for people-to-people ties, there are many Canadians who want the relationship with India to be improved, Indo-Canadians who have family and business ties in the country. So I think This will be not an easy situation. There will be still many challenges ahead, but this is a great start to rebuilding a relationship that has been on ice for too long.
Okay, we're going to pause that there for a second. Look, let people at home know about a change in things here. We were expecting to hear from Prime Minister Mark Carney next hour, the second hour of the show. There's a delay. We're waiting to get some absolute clarity on that. We'll let you know. But in the meantime, we'll continue to cover the big issues here at the G7 summit because Canada and the U.S. have agreed to set a 30-day timer and try to reach a new trade deal before that clock runs out. Up next, new details on how that was decided and what the accelerated talks will look like. Katie Simpson's going to be here. Stay with me. U.S. President Donald Trump may have left the G7 summit early, but he left Canada with some hope of a new economic and security deal. Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney agreed to aim for a new agreement within 30 days. That sets the deadline for July 16th. But speaking last night from Air Force One, Trump was asked about negotiations with Canada.
You're going to have to pay a lot of tariffs and things. You're going to have to pay a lot of money for the dome, for the Iron Dome. They want to be a part of it. We may make a separate deal on that, by the way. We discussed that, yeah, with the dome. That may be a separate deal. They want to be at 71 billion. They're going to pay.
There could be a dome thing separate from the tariff.
They'll be in the dome. Yeah, they'll be under the dome.
Okay, the CBC's Katie Simpson is here with me in Banff, under the Banff Dome, Katie, not the Iron Dome, not the Golden Dome. Look,
not yet anyway.
The 30-day timeline, but the president, you know, as he flies away, is still talking about tariffs and how wonderful they are. I mean, how promising is this 30-day window?
Well, here's the thing. What we are learning from sources between myself and our wonderful colleague Louis Blouin over at Radio Canada, we understand that this 30-day deadline is a way for Canada to try to put some pressure on the Americans to try to get things across the finish line in a timely fashion. By putting it out there on the record in writing, the hope is that it will push things a little bit further. However, one senior Canadian government source speaking to me says, listen, the Prime Minister wouldn't have said this, wouldn't have done this if he didn't think it was actually possible that something like this could be achieved. So it is about building pressure. What my colleague Louis Blouin has been told is that, you know, the Canadian, and I've heard this as well, that Canadians, they keep going to these meetings. They've been happening almost on a weekly basis between the Canadian ambassador, Kirsten Hillman, and American officials. Dom LeBlanc, the minister involved in Canada-U.S. trade, he's involved in all of this as well. But essentially what we understand is happening is that the Canadians are going in with detailed, specific proposals, you know, ready to say this is how a deal could look, this is how it could work. And then it's typically received well by the Americans, but then the Americans don't respond in kind. They're not bringing back the specific proposals that they're ready to work with or anything like that. And it sort of is at this point where I'm told by a source that the Canadians want to get those T's crossed, those I's dotted, and get this moving forward. And the hope is that date, that 30-day deadline, is going to help push this further.
Okay, so it's like a group project where only one side is doing their share of the work, right? All right, so T's and I's, can't spell tariffs without either. How do things unfold from here? We're told meetings this week, but, you know, I think Dom LeBlanc's on his way back to Ottawa and different things. Like, what's next?
Well, some Americans did stay behind, even though Donald Trump went back, but largely it is expected that they were dealing with all of the other meetings that Donald Trump was supposed to attend and participate in, which did not happen because Donald Trump left. So that's one aspect of it. There had been hope that possibly there's going to be another meeting between the Canadians and the Americans on Friday to try and sort of, you know, push ahead with the framework. But really, this is going to require, it takes two to tango, right? And so this is going to, if the Canadians are coming forward with these proposals, like we are understanding from senior Canadian government sources, they need to see some progress from the Americans, at least at this point. By putting that, you know, sort of timeline, like meet, pass or fail moment here, you know, it sort of sets up for this, okay, you know, we tried or whatever it's going to be. They're going to have to figure out, do they retaliate with you know, tariffs because the tariffs on steel and aluminum went? What is Canada going to do? So it puts things on a track to either have a pass or fail moment in 30 days, and it apparently is something the Canadians feel they need to have in order to push it ahead.
So just as a final point, I mean, you know, I look at this two ways. Like Mark Carney, putting the 30-day timeline out there in written form in a statement from the Prime Minister's office. He's not a Prime Minister at this point that seems interested in just gestures, right? So confidence there, or is it just frustration? And this is a line in the sand that it's time to get this over and done with, and then we start the retaliation, or is it both? I think should we view it?
I think it's two things can be true at the same time, and that was sort of what has been stressed to me and Louis Blouin, is that, look, they want to push for these things, and they think it can be achievable. At the same time, they need to sort of needle things along and say, listen, are we going to meet this deadline, and try and pressure the Americans into getting something there? So the other thing is, though, as much as these conversations are going on at lower levels, you know, with Howard Lutnick and Jameson Greer, who's in charge of trade, all of these conversations that are happening, it's ultimately up to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, again, at this summit, talking about how he's a tariff person. He thinks they're simple. It's a whole philosophy for him. So really, at this point, it's about trying to convince a guy who has, you know, hooked a large part of his economic foreign policy to this idea that this idea is bad.
Yeah, and mercantilism is back. Okay, Katie, thanks so much. That's the CBC's Katie Simpson here with me in Banff. We're going to get some reaction on this. Go back to our panel here, Avina Najibullah, Arif Lalani, and Brian Clow. And Brian, look, you played a pretty key role. You were in the middle of a lot of things in the first Trump negotiation, so you've got, you know, the best real-time experience on this. What do you make of this 30-day deadline, what we saw yesterday and what we've heard since, and where this leaves the state of these conversations to try to get these tariffs gone?
Well, first, this does remind me of 2018, 2019, when we were in intense ongoing discussions with the Americans over NAFTA, but also steel and aluminum. And there were times where we thought we were close to a deal, but we got stuck on one or more issues. And clearly that has happened here. I think both the Americans and Canadians came into this G7 wanting some sort of agreement, but clearly they didn't get there because it appears to me that there are two sticking points. One, the Americans have not yet signaled that they're prepared to return tariff levels to where they were in January before Trump took office. And secondly, the Americans are asking for so many concessions from the Canadians that the Canadians are saying that's too much. So these talks will continue. The 30-day timeline is a good thing to force further discussion. But where I disagree with a lot of the initial observations of yesterday's announcements of the timeline, the 30-day timeline, is I think a lot of people saw that as, okay, we will have a deal in 30 days. Well, not if we don't overcome these disagreements. And I think it's very much a possibility that in 30 days, both sides say, look, we're not done yet. We're going to keep talking. Final comment on this is the challenge for that. Canada has leverage here, but has some real problems. The leverage comes from the fact that the country and our economy, broadly speaking, is weathering the Trump storm. We have the lowest average tariff rate of any country in the world, but we have a few sectors, steel, aluminum, auto, and lumber, that are just getting hammered. And lumber tariffs are actually set to go up in the fall if those aren't resolved. So the Canadians, this is why they're motivated to try to get to a deal, but I'm sure Mark Carney's not just going to accept a bad deal.
No, that's certainly not the impression we got. But just, Brian, a follow-up I have for you. The dynamic Katie described, that the Canadians are going there with these detailed proposals to try to move past this and nothing is coming back. Was that your experience in dealing with the Americans the first time around, or is this sort of new and unique to this particular iteration of the Trump administration?
There would be periods in the first Trump term where the negotiation was like that. We would go in with our professional negotiators led by Steve Verheuvel with very detailed, concrete proposals. The Americans not always on the same page and not always ready to engage on that same level of detail.
Okay. Veena, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, should we be optimistic about the 30 days, or as Brian lays it out pretty clearly, there are some big outstanding issues and at times, as Katie says, a not as engaged partner as you would like to see?
It's going to be challenging. It's good to have a deadline, but I think we have to see this also in contrast to how other countries are doing. In particular, apart from the UK, there have been no other deals. For this particular meeting, I think Japan was really hoping. They've had a number of rounds of meetings and were hoping to get something done. And of course, they didn't. Same thing is true for Korea. Same thing is true for India. So Canada, we're in a challenging situation, but in comparison to others, short of the UK, we're doing relatively well. And of course, we'll need to continue to push and not to concede on things that are just red lines for us. And I think in some ways, we also need to see where things end up between US and China. I mean, the truce that they have can fall apart. This is sort of a one day on, next day off situation, and it will have ramifications for the kind of deals that we make with the Americans as well.
Arif, your thoughts?
Look, I think sometimes what you see in these negotiations that don't seem to go anywhere is because one side doesn't really have a mandate. And it may be that on the American side, while the officials wanted to move things along, there really wasn't a decision at a strategic and leader level. So something that has the two leaders saying, look, we want some movement within 30 days, I think helps the officials. And it may have been that the American officials were really looking for something like this to help them move things along in their own process.
Right, so having that focus, at least in the, because it was interesting how it unfolded yesterday, Arif. There was, you know, we go to these things, there's going to be what you call a press spray, where the two leaders are in the room, and these are meant to be quick, like the Modi one we just showed. But with Donald Trump, he takes so many questions, and it goes on for a long period of time, and news happens. But Prime Minister Carney and President Trump met for like close to half an hour in private before the cameras came in, and then they had an extended bilateral meeting after that with more officials, which led to the 30-day timeline. So was that about getting some alignment, do you think, between the Prime Minister and the President to send a consistent signal to the officials, like sort of building on what you were talking about there about getting a mandate for one side of these talks?
I suspect it was. I mean, often they'll say, look, how do you want to handle this? Let's have a common message. So I think that was part of it. You know, it was very interesting to note in their exchange. Again, it was a very polite, friendly exchange between the two leaders. Everyone is always on edge with President Trump in these encounters, but it really did feel like, you know, there's a decision here to at least try and work to get a deal. And I think if I'm on the Canadian side, if that's the mood, I want to try and lock in as much as I can. And so I think that's also, let's see how much we can get done in 30 days.
Right. So Brian, just the way I outlined that sequence, that looked and felt a bit different than what I saw at the various summits I went to with Prime Minister Trudeau. I mean, what do you make of that sort of change in the scheduling there to have a very private, just the two leaders beforehand, before you have your extended meeting with officials and your public component with the media?
I'd have to go back and review, but I'm sure at different summits, perhaps not attached to the formal bilateral, but Justin Trudeau and Donald Trump definitely had some moments one-on-one time. But look, those one-on-one conversations can often be the most productive, not just on substance, but on relationship building. And clearly, the new Prime Minister is getting off on the right foot in terms of a positive tone in the relationship with Donald Trump. What I would note on that, though, is we've seen it with Donald Trump and his relationships around the world. Positive tone often doesn't get you very far, and ultimately it comes down to substance. I would point out Georgia Maloney, who's in Alberta with you. She was an all-star in the eyes of Republicans, including the people around Donald Trump and I think Donald Trump himself. But she got slapped with the same reciprocal tariffs that the whole world got slapped with. And I know her team was quite surprised by that when it happened. But what it shows me is positive relationship is a good start, a good foundation, but it's nowhere near what's needed to get to concrete deals.
Well, Veena, on that point, as a final point before we take another break, I mean, the relationship has been getting better between the Prime Minister and the President ever since the Oval Office meeting, but the tariffs have doubled on steel and aluminum in that same time period, right? And while they talk about the 30 days, you mentioned the UK. They did sign something here. Chancellor Merz from Germany has suggested that he thinks they'll be able to settle their tariff issues with the President by the summer. There does seem in the air a desire perhaps by the U.S. to settle some of these things. I mean, is it noise, or should we view that hopefully?
I think, yes, they will try to settle something, but we have to go back to what President Trump said, that he's ultimately a tariff man, and he wants to maintain a certain baseline tariffs, which is really a non-starter for Canada. It's also a non-starter for other allies like Japan on specific sectors. So the reason the Japan tariff deal, for instance, hasn't happened is because of the auto sector and steel and aluminum, so issues which are important for us as well. So it doesn't seem that President Trump believes that any country, whether it's the closest ally like Canada or other allies like NATO or Japan, that they should have some kind of special treatment. He wants a baseline 10% on everyone. That's going to be difficult to move him from. It's the conceptual difference, as the president said himself, right? That he has a certain concept. Prime Minister Carney has a different concept that's a bit broader, more comprehensive. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what we're able to do in the 30 days and how that fits into other things around security and defense as well.
Okay, we're going to take another quick break, but up still to come on the show, the G7 summit will have forged ahead today without U.S. President Donald Trump and in the shadow of an escalating conflict between Israel and Iran. Coming up, what Trump's early departure could signal to the Middle East and the rest of the world. That's next. President Donald Trump is fueling speculation the United States may join Israel's military assault against Iran. After leaving the G7 summit a day early, Trump gathered his top security advisors in the Situation Room today. The president is also mobilizing jets and aircraft carriers overseas, and he's demanding Iran surrender. The CBC's Sasha Petrusik joins us now from Washington. So, Sasha, there's a fast-moving situation, but we know the meeting in the Situation Room has ended. Any clear indication of what Trump is going to do?
Well, David, there's a lot that's been going on behind the scenes. Obviously, we don't know the details of what's happened in the Situation Room. Various plans are obviously in the works. We also know that there have been reports here that Donald Trump spoke to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today. So, you know, there's many pieces that are moving around right now. We know that Israel has been pressuring the United States for some time to take a more active role in this conflict between Iran and Israel ever since Israel attacked. And the United States has been reluctant to do that. But we have also seen movement, I suppose, in what Donald Trump has been saying, or at least posting today. Starting with a statement that he's looking for something more than a ceasefire in this war between Iran and Israel, that he wants Iran's nuclear program stopped, that they cannot have a nuclear program, and maybe that he wants it destroyed, which is stronger language than we've heard from Trump and from the White House, from the administration, since this war started. Now, that was only 4 days ago, although it may seem like a little bit longer than that. He's had a number of posts, too, which, again, give this idea that he's moving in a direction of American military involvement. He's boasted that
Okay, we just lost Sasha Petrusik. I'm not sure what happened there, but we lost our connection as he was bringing us up to speed. We're going to try to connect with him as soon as we can, because obviously we want to hear the rest of what is happening in the United States. So stay tuned. We're going to get Sasha back. In the meantime, as luck would have it, we have Ashley Burke standing by, and we have some breaking news to bring you from here in the G7. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who traveled to Canada for the summit, is cutting his visit short, it seems. And Ashley Burke has more on this. She joins me now. She's also here in Banff. So Ashley, what's happening here? Why is President Zelensky leaving early?
Well, David, I was down at the summit site in Kananaskis today speaking to the Ukrainian delegations and sources within it. And that's when we learned that President Zelensky, he's going to be getting on his plane and heading back to Kyiv tonight after the talks wrap up. And that was not what was planned. He was supposed to fly to Calgary. He had planned events there, including a press conference. That's all being called off. And this source told me that that's because of two things. One, that deadly attack that happened overnight in the capital in Kyiv, but as well, that the program of the G7 changed. So what changed? Well, Donald Trump, he left that summit before Zelensky even arrived on site today. And Zelensky traveled here wanting to sit down and have face-to-face time with Trump. His goal was to push him to move forward with tougher sanctions against Russia and to try and put pressure on Moscow. That didn't happen, and he's going to be leaving tonight without that meeting. You can only imagine how disappointing, upset, and perhaps even mad he could be about that.
Okay, this is not a summit that has gone the way I think a lot of people wanted it to go. Not getting the joint statement on Ukraine. I'm sure that is a frustration to President Zelensky, but not leaving entirely empty-handed, right? So tell us about his morning bilateral with the Prime Minister when he spoke with Mark Carney, and they outlined some more support for President Zelensky and his people.
Yeah, David, he was after that support from the U.S. because it's not the same level. Like, he already has support from Europe and Canada. That would have been an additional level of pressure. But he did get some more support from Canada today. And I was there when Zelensky arrived on site to meet Mark Carney. This was a very somber arrival compared to when the other leaders arrived. Mark Carney put his hand on his shoulder, said something to him that we couldn't hear. And then during that bilat, the Prime Minister came out and really condemned that attack overnight in the capital, calling it it barbaric and said that he was going to be coming forward with more support. That's something Zelensky said he needs right now. He needs allies to step up. Canada announcing a $2 billion package to try and help. And that includes money for everything from ammunition to more drones to armored vehicles, helicopters, and as well another $2 billion they're going to help free up, the government says, in loans from Russian frozen assets and new sanctions. So those are some of the measures that Canada's coming forward with. But Zelensky seemed thankful, but he also talked about that he wants there to be a ceasefire. He wants those negotiations with Russia, peace talks to happen, and that's going to involve pressure. And the pressure he was looking for today was from the U.S. And he's leaving as well without a joint statement on the war in Ukraine from G7 leaders. A government source says that's because the U.S. wanted to water down the language when it came to some of the pointed things they wanted to say about Russia over concerns that would affect talks between the U.S. and Russia over trying to end this war.
Okay, Ashley, thank you very much. That's the CBC's Ashley Burke here in Banff at the G7. Okay, we've lost Sasha Petrusik. I'm not sure what's going to happen there, but we're going to bring in our panel to talk about what is happening between the U.S., Iran, and Israel and the implications for NATO and the rest of the G7. Vina Najibullah, Arif Lalani, and Brian Clow are back now. Arif, I'd like to start with you. I mean, we are seeing reporting from people like Barak Ravid, who's very well connected with the Israeli government and the U.S. government about the possibility and maybe even the expectation in Israel that the U.S. is getting ready to get into this on the Israeli side against Iran, in particular to deal with the Fordo nuclear facility. We don't know if that's where it's going to go, but what are your thoughts on what's been playing out over the last 4 or 5 days, but especially the last 24 hours with the president here at the G7?
Yeah, look, I think the objectives are clearly much broader than Iran's nuclear program. I think there are probably two big objectives. One is to get to some of the stockpiles of the enriched uranium and the facilities that are buried deep underground. And the Israelis on their own do not have that capability, but the Americans do with their bombers. And so the one decision is, does America get involved with these bunker busting munitions to really get at the nuclear capability? But second, it's very clear that the kind of targeting the Israelis are doing is also aimed at regime change. And we have seen people predicting regime change off and on. I would say, from what I'm hearing from people, that this is probably the weakest this regime has been in the 40-some years that it's in power, and I will not be surprised. I think a question now is, how does this regime end? And there is a chaotic way, which we have seen happen, for example, during the Arab Spring in Libya and elsewhere. And there is one that would require some more global management of the type we haven't seen, which would be for the leader to leave. I mean, we saw that with Assad in Syria and a much more orderly transition. So I'm not saying it's inevitable, but I think this is the closest we have come in 40 years to seeing this happen.
You know, Vina, it's interesting because, we were talking earlier about the lack of a unanimous statement on Ukraine. There was a G7 leader statement on the recent developments between Israel and Iran. But there was reporting in the Washington Post and other places that they had to scale it back. They had to water it down because, again, the U.S. objected to the idea of calling for Israel to show any kind of restraint and to call for de-escalation. And, we heard from the president on Air Force One last night when President Macron suggested he was returning to work on a ceasefire. He said, no, it's not a ceasefire. It's something better than that. It's an end. That can mean a lot of things. How do you see it?
Absolutely. There was a statement from the G7, but the G7 is not unanimous on this issue. You've heard others, including President Macron, mention that regime change in Iran can be very dangerous because we don't know what's going to come next. We've seen this not go well in Libya and Iraq and elsewhere. So the region is very worried about a broader war, but also about a potential destabilization inside Iran itself. We've heard other G7 leaders say the same. They want restraint, they want de-escalation. It's unclear where the US stands. I mean, obviously, this whole situation is quite remarkable. This idea that President of the US needs to leave the G7 meeting to be able to handle a situation rather than to coordinate with the closest allies of the US is quite remarkable. And now everybody's waiting to see what happens in the next 24 hours and whether or not the US will enter another regional conflict in the Middle East after saying that they don't want to be embroiled in conflicts, after mentioning that they want to pivot to the Indo-Pacific. Well, so much for that.
Well, Brian, I think we were both in Charlevoix in 2018 when the president made another dramatic departure from the G7 under very different circumstances. What do you make of that point that he felt the need to leave? I don't know if he needed to be in the Situation Room with his military advisors and all of the various paraphernalia a president has at their disposal in a facility like that they wouldn't have in Kananaskis. But what did you make of that decision to abruptly leave and go back to Washington at this moment?
Couple things. Clearly, what's going on in the Middle East, that's a very valid reason for the U.S. president to be in Washington with his senior military officials in order to handle that situation. That said, it is not unusual to see Donald Trump leave these international summits early. And I think in addition to the Middle East crisis, he probably had enough time with the other world leaders yesterday that he felt he didn't need a second day being talked at by them, particularly on trade issues. And further, it allowed him to avoid President Zelensky, which I think was something he wanted to avoid. So put all those together, I think it explains his early departure.
Yeah, the plausible theories there. Arif, I want to come to you for the last word. You talked about this could be the closest in 40 years to regime change in Iran. I know in our many conversations throughout the various conflicts over the past 18 months or so in the Middle East, it's always been about the widening conflict. But Hezbollah so degraded, Hamas so degraded, the Houthis limited, Syria under new management. The way Israel is striking Iran suggests a confidence that, not that it's consequence-free, but the consequences appear to be very limited, especially with the U.S. going in here. I mean, what does that tell us about the power dynamic at play there right now?
Well, look, I think none of the Gulf Arab states are friends of Iran. And Israel has certainly proven for the last 2 years that it can take on and fight its enemies. But I think what people in the region are asking is, can Israel actually work with its friends? Because it needs to do both. So it's not for tomorrow, but the other issue that many countries are taking away from this is the incredible exercise of power by Israel. And the response for some of them is going to be that we also have to build up our military.
Okay, look, we're going to let you go, but I want to thank you all. We covered a lot of ground on a lot of serious topics, and it's going to have smart, serious, experienced people with someone like me to be able to do that. So thank you, Vinay Jabula, Arif Lalani, and Brian Clow for guiding us through all of the developments here at the G7, the Middle East, and around the world. We appreciate your time.
Great to be here.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
All right, coming up, we're going to take a break, but coming up next on the show, we got a panel of journalists who will join me to talk about the key moments from this summit and what we might expect to hear from Prime Minister Mark Carney later tonight. So stay right there. We've got that right ahead. Okay, it was supposed to be this hour, but it's going to be in a couple of hours. That's when Prime Minister Mark Carney will deliver his closing news conference after 2 days of talks with some of the world's most powerful leaders. Okay, as we wait for that, let's take a look back at some of the highlights from this G7 summit.
The Right Honourable Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada.
We're gathering at one of those turning points in history. I think we all recognize that turning point where the world looks to this table for leadership. Nostalgia isn't a strategy. We have to change with the times and to build a better world. Mr. President, welcome to Canada. The G7 is nothing without U.S. leadership.
I appreciate it, and we've developed a very good relationship, and we're going to be talking about trade and many other things. I'm a tariff person. I've always been a tariff. It's simple. It's easy. Mark has a different concept, which is something that some people like. But we're going to see if we can get to the bottom of it today.
Okay. Thank you. Why are you leaving the G7 early for Washington?
Well, I have to be back.
I would like to start by condemning, in the strongest terms, the latest outrage, barbarism from Russia.
Thank you for the military package. It's important for our soldiers to be strong at the battlefield.
The fact that you decided to bring Canada to the 2% spending when it comes to NATO this year is really fantastic.
I'd like to welcome everyone here to the most important session of these 2 days. We have a very important agenda together, but it's a sign of the maturity, I think, of the G7 that we come together. And with that, we are going to get to work. Alors, merci beaucoup. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, we got a panel of journalists here to talk about some of those key moments and where things are now that the G7 summit is just about over. Marty Patrickin is the Quebec correspondent for The Logic. The Globe and Mail's Shannon Proudfoot is in Ottawa looking after the studio while I'm away. And here with me in Banff, CBC senior writer in the Parliamentary Bureau, Aaron Weary. Shannon, I'm curious to see what the view is in the Ottawa bubble, but outside the Banff bubble, if I can describe it that way. I mean, what's your sense of where things are going with the summit here?
What I find so fascinating, maybe this is less an Ottawa bubble view than it is a feature writer view, because I'm sort of always looking for, metaphor and a sense of what's going on behind the scenes. What I find so fascinating about this G7 meeting is that this is sort of a real-time reenactment of like the metaphor of the world stage now, right? I mean, you quite literally have the US leaving early, but even when Donald Trump was here, there was this really strange quality of sort of talking with him. He was sitting immediately beside Mark Carney, but Mark Carney sort of talking around him. There's this sense of a huge presence that's actually an absence or even an obstruction, an object. There was that kind of remarkable opening set of remarks that Carney made, talking about how nostalgia isn't a strategy. The world looks to this table for leadership. We're at a turning point in history. Those just struck me as remarkable statements to make, because all of those things are screamingly true in a way that is sort of wildly unflattering and indicting of the guy immediately to, I think he was on Carney's left. It's about Trump, but Trump is sitting right there, and Carney manages to sort of say it in a surgical way that doesn't sound immediately threatening or insulting. And so much of this was about managing the volatility of the U.S., the volatility of the U.S. president, but also the absence of kind of, the world's traditional police officer, banker, all of those things just moving off that central position and everyone having to kind of reconstitute themselves around it. It was kind of amazing to watch it happen in real time.
Yeah.
Marty, Shannon's got that's a really interesting observation there, because Mark Carney does interject in these moments, in these big meetings, with these really good lines that distill the moment. It's like he's narrating the transition of the world order, in front of everybody, like at a side in a play. I mean, what's your high-level takeaway of how things are going here?
I mean, look, I think, just to add to what Shannon said very eloquently just then, the extent to which these things, that is to say G7 meetings hosted in Canada or elsewhere, but for Canada, how much they are of a zero-sum game. Things can only go wrong. Look what happened last time, the Charlevoix parallel, 2018. Trump left as well without signing the most mealy-mouthed of communiques at the end of it. He did a similar thing today, except he didn't leave in a tiff. And in the zero-sum game, when it involves Donald Trump, him not leaving in a tiff and being mad, I think counts as a win. You recall from 2018, he turned on Trudeau and didn't ever really turn back. He has a habit of becoming enemies with someone, becoming friends with them again, and then becoming enemies with them. That didn't happen with Trudeau. He just sort of discarded Trudeau onward after that point. I don't think that's going to happen with Mark Carney. Certainly not at this. And look, if we're going for wins, look what he did today. Yeah, he would manage to bring in Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum. $56 billion trade in 2024. Modi, Indian Prime Minister Modi, $30 billion in goods and services in 2023. He got to greet on the world stage Zelensky from Ukraine. Had mad props about what he's going to do with defense spending. He had, as my colleague Joanna Smith reported today in The Logic, a smaller, not an agreement, but an agreement to work on an agreement with the UK on sticking points and on trade and foodstuffs. So, look, all of this, I think, in terms of if you're counting this as something that where things can only go wrong, I think he did pretty well today. I think there are certain aspects within all of this that you can count as a win.
Yeah, and look, we're going to talk more about the Canada-U.S. trade situation and those negotiations a little bit later in the segment. But, on the high-level stuff, Aaron, the Prime Minister showed a good command of the cabinet table, obviously. When you save them from extinction, you have some props when you show up to the office. The First Minister's table has run well. Sticking points on Iran, Israel here, sticking points on Ukraine here, but broadly, what's your sense of how it went?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what you're measuring it against. If we're measuring it against there wasn't a blow up, this didn't descend into chaos.
A plus.
Donald Trump didn't stop off mad, then I guess this was a success for Mark Carney. I'm sure when he does his news conference later today, he will point to the statements they've put out, as achievements that are going to go towards things that are meaningful, on wildfires, on artificial intelligence, and so on. But it's hard to get away though from the fact that they couldn't come to an agreement on a joint statement on Israel and Iran that called for a ceasefire. They couldn't come to a joint statement on Ukraine. We'll see what Carney puts out as a chair statement later. And even on the wildfire. I can't remember what term they're using.
Kananaskis statement on wildfire?
Wildfire charter response, or wildfire response charter.
Yeah.
Even on that, if you check, there's no reference to climate change. So the fissures and the divisions and the roadblocks, as Shannon referred to, are pretty apparent still. And I keep coming back to something Carney said even before the conference began when he had his meeting with Donald Trump, and he said, the G7 is nothing without U.S. leadership. I think there's a half dozen different ways to read that statement. One is that it was potentially set up to flatter Donald Trump, but I think the question it raises is, okay, but what is U.S. leadership at this point, and how exactly is it contributing to the G7, and what does it mean for the G7? Because if U.S. leadership means, the G7 can't agree to much and can't, call for a ceasefire in Iran, and it can't say climate change when it's referring to wildfires, what exactly are we talking about?
Yeah, the closest it came on wildfires is they agree to raising awareness of the different causes of wildfires and measures to prevent them.
Many different causes.
Yes, many different causes. Mistakes were made. But Shannon, on the point that Aaron mentioned there, that comment that Mark Carney made to Donald Trump right off the top when he said, the G7 is nothing without U.S. leadership, it is at once an attempt at flattery and praise, but it is also an articulation of what's at stake in this particular moment at this particular summit, right?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely both of those things. It's flattery, and it's also a bit of a warning, maybe an underhanded warning that's just a little too subtle for the president to catch, because that's not sort of the way he operates. The way Carney was, and I actually don't mean that it sounds catty, it's actually an analytical comment, and catty, I guess it can be two things at once. And Carney's very surgical, right, in what he says. He's very strategic. I've found it really interesting the last couple of months to watch him, sort of learn to be prime minister in real time. Because you can see the wheels turning, but he's pretty good at the strategic stuff, so it's like the wheels of a finely tuned machine turning. You can see what he's trying to do and say and not say, but he's being pretty artful about it. There was, if we remember, in terms of him saying things that sort of seem noteworthy about Trump, remember there was that leak about their call soon after Carney became leader, in which it was leaked after the fact that he had supposedly called him transformative. And at the time, that sort of was received as Carney being a bit two-faced, because it made it sound like he was flattering Trump privately while, bashing him with his elbows up publicly. But then Carney made a point of saying it publicly in the meeting in the Oval Office. And the word transformative, I mean, a lot of things are transformative.
All sorts of things.
Marvelous things
Exactly.
are transformative, so are hurricanes and tornadoes. It actually reminds me of, the Michael Lewis book, The Fifth Risk, where I'm going to ruin it for anyone else who reads it, so I'm sorry, because it's wonderful. But he has this extended metaphor, as Michael Lewis always does, where he talks about this woman who had a farm, and she had, kind of this cruddy old barn on her property that she wanted to get torn down. And when the tornado blew through, it didn't take out the farm, it took out her house. So the idea being that the wish for a Trump presidency, this was about Trump 1, and the wish for sort of some destructive force that's going to upend things that you think isn't working, it might not take out the thing you want it to take out. And I feel like Carney is kind of walking that same rhetorical knife's edge with talking about how the G7 is nothing without the US, because look, we saw this week, that's what that is now.
Yeah, and Marty, you're here, and inside the North Atlantic bubble, the G7 is kind of all of the key players, of the post-World War II order. But the extended stuff today, South Africa, Brazil, India, the BRICS nations minus China, minus Russia, that sort of counterweight that exists primarily with global South powers, to the G7. And you're just reminded of the way this thing is supposed to work and its inability to work, as Aaron pointed out, on the big military and security crisis in Europe and the big military and security crisis in the Middle East. Like they're almost there, but it's like just short.
Yeah, and again, he's basically at the head of a table full of people that don't necessarily get along, or get along, and then there's one person who notably left, and I think that the strength and the art of what Mr. Carney was able to do today was, to use Aaron's word, was the fissures that were there, the cracks that were there, they remain cracks and fissures, and they didn't get any bigger. Again, not to to say what I said before, like it's a zero-sum thing. If you can keep things in order, if you can not poke the bear, if you can provide enough pageantry, which is effectively what Carney has to do when Trump is anywhere in the room. If you can do all that, I think you can count it as a win. It is not an easy thing to do. I don't envy him whatsoever.
Aaron, last word, then we're going to take a quick break.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can still argue there's value to having these leaders around the table, even if the United States is there and they don't agree. There's value to everyone talking, and to keep that dialogue going and to bringing other leaders to the table. So I don't want to say that these 2 days, or in Mr. Trump's case, the one day that he was here was a loss. But I don't think you can really get away from the fact that if this had been a G7 a year ago, they would have agreed about a lot more. And they may have made pretty definitive statements here that they couldn't. And it's hard to get away from that reality. And it seems to be something that's going to be an ongoing challenge, no matter who's chairing the G7 for the next 4 years.
Yeah, look, we saw it in his first term. Every G7 from one year to the next, increasingly more fragile, increasingly more difficult, everyone on eggshells, and what they were able to work on, and in a united way, it just got scaled back. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, the Prime Minister, Mark Carney that is, because there's lots of them around, he met one-on-one with the NATO Secretary General this morning. We're going to, our panel sticking around to talk about that meeting and how Canadians will react to Mark Carney's performance at this G7 summit. Prime Minister Mark Carney met with the Secretary General of NATO this morning, just 1 week after committing to meeting the alliance's defense spending target. Earlier in the show, I spoke to the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, who said he is pleased by this fast-tracked commitment.
We now have the whole of the alliance, all 32 countries, the whole of the alliance at 2% before the summit in The Hague next week. Whilst at the beginning of the year, we had still 8 countries not making the 2%. So this is really great news.
Okay, our panel of journalists is back on this. Marty Patrick, Shannon Proudfoot, and Aaron Weary. Marty, a promise that's been 11 years in the making, I guess, is fast-tracked now. We're going to do it after 11 years instead of waiting the full 16. But, you know, this is a big money commitment and an important, cover charge to pay if you want to be taken seriously at the serious tables. What do you make of what we heard from the NATO Secretary General here today in response to that, and what he's going to be asking for next as wasps invade my set? So bear with me as I try to kill the bugs.
I think military spending is a fantastic way for the Liberal government to basically do 2 things at once. They get to increase spending on military and look good on the world stage, but it's also a massive infrastructure play, and that's pretty clear in the Liberal platform. The other thing too is look, it was a long time coming. It's been a long time coming. 2 things, I know we are a very polarized world, so it's for or against, black or white. 2 things can be true. Trump can be like a pseudo-fascist man baby, but he can also be true that Canada has, chronically shirked its responsibilities when it comes to its own national defense because it has relied so heavily on the United States. You can say the same thing about a lot of the European countries. This fixes that problem. Not only that, it also takes away the argument that Trump has, and it's against Canada and the 51st state stuff. And also, it's a third thing too. It's an exercise in sovereignty, much like our energy resources, much like our goods and services. The use of those is very much an exercise in Canadian sovereignty and putting it in Donald Trump's head that Canada exists as a country. I'm glad we're finally doing it. And the last thing I would say too is very important to say is that the shirking of national defense spending on the part of Canada has been a bipartisan exercise over the last 25 years. Liberal and conservatives, everybody's guilty, and it was time to get fixed.
Well, look, basically since Mulrooney, right? Like it's going back that long. I think that was the last time they were at the sort of the 2% target. But Shannon, how do you view this? It's pretty clear. Marty touched on it a little bit that they're marrying defense policy and industrial policy in a fairly substantial way. At least that's what Mark Carney's intending to do here. And even some of the big high-level things we got an agreement on here at the G7 on artificial intelligence and quantum computing. These are also industrial goals of this government, but things that if you develop them, you can include it in your national security spending because so much of that is going to be about how you deal with asymmetrical warfare in the future.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch the government and Carney in particular linking all these different concepts and sort of using them to reinforce each other. The idea that defense spending is security, is sovereignty, is industrial policy. We've also heard Carney talk really explicitly about, he's talking about revisiting the F-35 deal, maybe giving more money for really big defense products to countries that are better friends than the U.S. We saw it wasn't an announcement, I think it was more of a sort of a leak last week about the upcoming European defense deal, Canada signing on to rearm Europe. So there's been this sense of sort of these concentric widening circles of Canada wanting to really put in the window and underline the idea of, guess what, Donald, we are our own country. We have powerful friends. We're not a toy country. Marty's right that 2 things can be true at the same time, that Donald Trump is, an addled, troubled individual who is also right about Canada shirking. It actually reminds me of that Onion headline, heartbreaking, worst person you know makes a great point. Sometimes he's right. Yeah. But I think this is part of a bigger pattern of everything turning upside down in the last 6 or 8 months. I mean, we never expected to have the U.S. president looking across the border at us like we were a lunch waiting to be eaten. And you can also see that in the public appetite for defense spending, the public appetite for all sorts of things. I just saw there was some new Angus Reid polling out that showed, I think it was 51% of Canadians approve of this big jack up in the spending, and about 17 or 18% would like to see us spend more. Part of the reason neglecting that has been a bipartisan project in Canada for decades is because there was never any juice in it. It was never anything that the Canadian public was really interested in. funny how having a guy talk about charging across the border and taking over your country sort of changes that view quite fundamentally.
Yeah, events have a way of focusing the mind. Look, Aaron, I'd agree to 6% of defense spending if some of it would get rid of the WASPs and harassing me and you while Shannon and Marty were talking. We are under attack here. I just want to let you know that here on the set. So, Aaron, while we have a temporary break in hostilities, your thoughts on this?
I think there obviously is an imperative to defense spending, and I think it is to increase defense spending. And I think this is one situation where the American interests and the sort of non-American NATO interests converge, because the Americans want to see everybody else, footing a larger bill for global defense, and the other NATO nations know they can't necessarily rely on the United States anymore. So I think there's a necessity to increase defense spending. I still think the question is exactly how does this get paid for? I mean, part of the reason, successive federal governments didn't spend more in defense is because they didn't need to, but also because there were other things they could spend money on. And I think we still need to see exactly how the math is going to work. So yes, we're getting to 2%. What does that look like if for the federal budget? And then if the further conversation is, well, maybe let's get to 3 or maybe let's get to 5. How on earth do you afford that without increasing revenue somewhere? So I think, I can see the kind of international win that Mark Carney gets for making this commitment. I think it's still sort of to be seen exactly how this gets paid for and exactly what the price is in either cuts or revenue changes.
Yeah, so I mean, some of the 3.5 can be the AI and quantum things. As you grow that industry, it gets included. But, the Prime Minister has talked a lot about there's going to need to be sacrifice. And at some point, we're going to find out exactly what he's talking about there. Okay, look, I want to thank the CBC's Aaron Weary for joining us. He's got to go. There's a few things he needs to write about. We're going to take a break. We'll be back with the panel. Katie Simpson's going to come back. But first, 30 days. That's how long the U.S. and Canada have agreed to take to come up with a new trade and security agreement. Should we buy that window? How promising is that? It's only a month. We're going to talk about that coming up next. Before his early departure from the G7 last night, U.S. President Donald Trump agreed to a timeline for a new economic and security deal with Canada. Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney said they would aim for a new agreement within 30 days, and that sets the deadline for July 16th. But speaking last night from Air Force One, Trump was asked about the negotiations with Canada.
You're going to have to pay a lot of tariffs and things. You're going to have to pay a lot of money for the dome, for the Iron Dome. They want to be a part of it.
Did you talk
we
about
may
that?
make a separate deal on that, by the way. We discussed that, yeah, with the dome. That may be a separate deal. They want to be at $71 billion. They're going to pay.
There could be a dome thing separate from the tariff.
They'll be in the dome. Yeah, they'll be under the dome.
All right, our journalist panel is back on this. Marty Patrickin, Shannon Proudfoot, and CBC senior reporter Katie Simpson. She's joining us. Aaron got chased off by the wasp and actually had to go right. He's on deadline. Marty, let's start with you. I mean, what do you make of the 30-day deadline that Mark Carney and President Trump have agreed to here? You know, the Prime Minister, not a guy to commit to empty gestures in public unless he thinks he's going to, at least that's our view of him at this point. 30 days, realistic or not?
I think it's realistic, and I think it's realistic for not much Mark Carney related. I think it's something in the U.S. ledger. I think Donald Trump absolutely needs to have some sort of score some sort of deal. He said, you know, whatever it was it how many 90 deals in 90 days? He's well behind on that kind of thing. And if you can't score the low hanging fruit that is the 51st state, after all, it doesn't look great for you. I think, but to come back on my point a little bit, there is a realization on the part of the Liberal government. We've talked a whole lot about interprovincial trade over the last little whiles and breaking down borders and doing that before July 1st, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's an innate realization, and this bears out in the evidence, that interprovincial trade is great. More trade with China, or pardon me, more trade with India is great. More trade with Europe is great, but you cannot replace the trade with the United States. I was down in La Beauce a few weeks ago, just before the election, and you know it's an area of Quebec that is literally sitting right on the border, and they've traded with America forever, literally like 150 years or something like this, and they've weathered ups and downs in America. They are visited upon by American economic storms more so than anybody else because they export almost all their stuff. And they said, look, we can weather this, but as they say in French, il y a des petites limites. And so it's time. The idea was, look, we can talk about posturing, we can do counter tariffs, et cetera, et cetera. That is all window dressing. Sit down, make a deal. We got to get back to work.
So Katie, catch us up to speed on exactly where we are, right? Because I know you and Louis Blouin are, you know, he's on a first name basis with the Power and Politics audience, as you are. You've got some information on where things are. I mean, catch us up on where things even are in the last hour or so. What's going on?
Yeah, so our understanding is that when these negotiations are taking place, the Canadian side, this is according to senior Canadian government sources, that when the Canadians come into these talks, they're making very specific pitches. They're bringing, you know, detailed proposals about what this deal could take shape. It's expected to be a broader, not just like a traditional trade deal, broader economic security trade kind of agreement, sort of to just deepen ties and sort of alleviate some of the concerns Donald Trump has been very loudly griping about in the Canada-U.S. relationship. And what we understand is that when the Canadians bring these sort of ideas and pitches to the table, they're warmly received by the Americans, but the Americans aren't responding in kind. They're not returning with, say, okay, here are our specific proposals. I've also heard that they might say, well, this is all great, but what about this irritant that Donald Trump has talked about? What about this irritant? It's something that has not been sort of involved in what the conversations are like. And so there's been a challenge in trying to keep the Trump folks focused on what the actual terms of this agreement are going to be. And it's still unclear whether some of the lower level officials that the Canadians are dealing with, are they actually speaking on Trump's behalf, or are they freelancing themselves? There's still some question there, which has always been sort of a challenge when dealing with any Trump administration.
Well, and Shannon, you know, when the guy can change his mind on a dime, how empowered and confident are you to commit to something, you know, and make progress? You got to wonder if the meetings yesterday and here were try to get a clear alignment on exactly, you know, what the marching orders were and then set this timeline to try to get everybody to get it done.
Yeah, that's just it. There's this fundamental underlying nihilism to this. Like, let's back up a step and remember there is currently a trade deal in place. Like it is legal. It was signed, sealed, and delivered. It was a beautiful trade deal, the most beautiful trade deal the world had ever seen, because a guy named Donald Trump wrote it the first time. So, I mean, I'm not at all dismissing the validity of talking about getting a new deal. Clearly, he needs to have someone pat his head and tell him he's got some wins here to move forward. So we have to do that to mitigate the economic damage. But it's like nothing he says is worth more than the air it's set on. Nothing he signs is worth more than, paper you could throw into a bonfire. So it's like you're standing on the deck of a pitching ship trying to figure things out, but there's so much instability built into the whole thing in the form of one man that I wouldn't want to be in charge of those negotiations. But I really agree with Marty that maybe the kind of, not a get out of jail free card, but maybe the little escape hatch here is that Tariff Man seems to be starting to have some wobbly thoughts about what tariffs will get him, because you've seen this sort of kind of gentle tiptoeing away. And so maybe then at that point you get to the area where you need to offer him some wins. You need to negotiate something new that looks splashy. Obviously, he agreed to the 30-day timeline. He gets to look like he's in the driver's seat, and he's, deigned to give permission to a lesser person to move forward. And then you kind of hope, because that's always been the only hope, right, is that Donald Trump's self-interest would be dented by this, and then we could all go back to something resembling sanity until the next time he feels sad about things. So that's where we are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Marty, look, the 30 days.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say.
No, you had something smart to say. You go.
This is a Canadian standoff, gentlemen, where you politely just insist the other person goes first. That's what we're having here.
No. I was just along the lines of trying to focus him, and the whole idea of the shifting sands and the fact that things change all the time with him. He mentioned the Golden Dome on his airplane just now. The Golden Dome didn't exist 10 minutes ago. It's like another one of those things that he gets this into his head. It's almost like the Golden Dome is, we're going to build it and Canada's going to pay for half of it, is of 2025, is like the Mexican wall that we're going to build in 2016 and Mexico is going to pay for it. It's a chimera. It's nothing, but it's these things. Like, can you imagine trying to negotiate in this climate? He's asking for, I don't know how many hundreds of billions of dollars for a thing that came out of nowhere, like literally a month and a half ago. I wouldn't envy anybody having to sit down and negotiate with this, and on either side, with the Americans or the Canadians.
Right. Well, Marty, you and I are the Golden Domes, at least on this panel, with the common look that we have here. But Katie, you get into this 30-day timeline, and look, I don't know how they settle on 30 days. I know there's NATO and a bunch of other things coming up this month, but you're getting into July, and that's kind of, you're getting into the beginning of the third economic quarter, and all the projections we saw on the tariffs, like that's when the pain was really going to start being felt in the United States, right? Not that there hasn't been pain along the way, but at a scale and maybe at a permanence where it really starts to hurt. That's where people were pointing to. That's going to be the pressure point for the U.S.
And the other thing is that's the Canadian deadline is about a week after the deadline for all these other countries, the 90 deals in 90 days that the Americans had promised. So far, the only thing they have to show is what they sort of re-announced, the broad trade agreement with the UK. And so far, they've not had dozens of deals. We've had all of these American officials come out and say, there's going to be like a few this week, there's going to be some this week, there's going to be some this week. And when the American officials talk, they generally don't bring up Canada unless you specifically mention it. That is something I found that has been sort of a challenge. We hear about all of these talks that are going on, and we know that the Canadians are in Washington, and these conversations are happening back and forth. But when the Americans or Trump, talk about, okay, we think we're close, it's never just Canada off the top of the head. That's something that's sort of has sort of stuck with me when I watch all of these appearances by the Trump surrogates as they go out on American network television. Canada is never really getting a mention unless they're specifically asked about, and then sometimes there are
you or Josh Wingrove. You guys keep bringing it up.
Well, no, and so it's listen, I gotta jump. We're gonna ask those questions, but it's something that doesn't come up, and so the Americans are going to be. July is going to be the month of trade. That's what we're going to call it here on Power and Politics. It's like a trade-a-palooza, because Donald Trump has got to figure out how he's dealing with all of these tariffs related to what's going on with the sort of the baseline tariffs, the Liberation Day stuff, where he announced, okay, everyone's going to have to pay all these different tariffs. He put them off. The expiry date is in early July, and that, I believe it's like July 9th. And so he's got to deal with that, and then Canada's right after that. So they got to figure that all out. And so it's going to be trade-a-palooza or no trade-a-palooza. Maybe maybe everything just gets worse, David.
Maybe we call it July. I mean, there's also that possibility. Look, we got about 90 seconds left, Shannon, but Katie's point there that the surrogates and the Trump administration, they don't bring up Canada unless asked. I look at that and look at Mark Carney's reaction on the steel and aluminum tariffs. This is not aimed specifically at us, and came up with a response that kind of keeps you just below the eye line of the U.S. government. That seems to be the approach, right? Try to, not be in the bullseye as you try to find some peace here.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a lot of it. And Canada, I don't think it's any surprise to us. We've lived next door to the U.S. for a long time now, that we are not top of mind for them the way they are top of mind for us. When you're a mouse who lives next to an elephant, that's the way it rolls. But like the reality is we will bear disproportionate economic pain for this. We are a smaller nation. We are very reliant on them for trade, but we're not powerless here, and it's not unreciprocal. It goes back and forth. And so again, it's back to that point of you just have to hope that the pain for them and for him is accumulating quietly, because I think it is a cumulative effect. You saw sort of very quick knee-jerk reactions back in the winter when the tariffs were first kicking in, and you saw auto plants talking about, shutting down shifts, laying people off, and that's sort of an anticipatory reaction to something that's coming. But you're going to start to see, or you have already, people's grocery prices, clothing prices going up, cars. It is cumulative. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts. And Canada will suffer a lot, but so will they. And so I think it is very much what you're saying with right. Carney. It's sort of flatter, manage the danger, try to fly below the radar, but also press our case at the same time, because we really need this resolved. It's a very delicate dance they're trying to do.
No, a delicate dance, there's no question about it. Just like the scheduling of the summit, the Prime Minister's news conference delayed for another hour. He'll be taking questions from reporters just as the puck drops in the Edmonton Oilers Florida Panthers game, and he's a big Oilers fan. We got to leave it there. We're out of time. We're going to take the network away. Marty Patrick and Shannon Proudfoot, thanks so much for today. Katie, thank you for everything here at the G7 these last couple of days. Thank you all for watching. I'm David Cochrane. This has been Power and Politics. Hannah Mansing tonight is up next on CBC News Network. Prime Minister Mark Carney's closing press conference at the G7 is scheduled to start at 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Mountain Time, so stay tuned for live coverage of that with Ian and his team. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow.